Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. We are very excited to have Dr. Theresa Ma and Dr. Ji-Yeon on the line with us. Dr. Theresa Ma is our state representative in the Illinois 24th District, and she was a former college professor who taught U.S. history, ethnic study, and Asian American studies. She was my professor. And then we have Dr. Ji-Yeon. She's the professor of Asian American history, Asian diasporas, race and gender, and oral history at Northwestern. She's also our One Book faculty director this year for Crying in Nishmark by Michelle Zahner. It is the first Asian American content for One Book, One Northwestern. So please follow the One Book website for the upcoming events this year. We'll have events for the whole school year surrounding this book, and Michelle Zahner will be coming on campus to speak with us in October. And before we get started, I also wanted to remind everyone our Juneteenth celebration with Dr. Arlene Geronimus will be on Thursday, June 15 at noon. It will be virtually online, and please look, the registration will be linked in the chat. So thank you both to be here with us today. I want to get started with talking about the definition of AAPI. When people see AAPI, they usually just think of one group of Asian. Can you tell us quickly what is the definition of AAPI?
Yeah, sure. You're talking about the definition of Asian American Pacific Islander, and that refers to people who live in the United States and its official colonies, such as Guam, Samoa, and Puerto Rico, who originate from the geographic area of Asia and the Pacific. And so that would include, for example, Native Hawaiians, Native Samoans, Filipinos, people from Burma, people from South Asia, so India, Pakistan, Bengal, etc., as well as the more commonly well-known East Asians, people from China, Korea, and Japan. So it's a very wide, diverse group. And as you can see, it's easy and very legitimate to ask the question, well, what do all of these people have in common? Why are they in that same designation?
And if I may add on to that, the reason, since Ivy mentioned that you had taken my Asian American Studies and Ethnic Studies courses, what these groups have in common in the United States is that they were part of a system of racialization. And so, in law, in culture, in representation, in our society from, when the United States started, there were ways in which groups that trace their ancestry to these places were seen as separate and inferior.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Theresa. And I'd also at this time like to make what I think is a really important point, right? Which is that Asian American Pacific Islander is primarily a racial category, right? And racial categories, right? The whole idea of race, right, is something that is externally imposed on people for somebody else's convenience, right? And it is never actually any kind of an identity. It's a category that society has imposed on people, never an identity.
But at the same time, it's been taken up as an identity in the last 50, 60 years, let's say, to push back on the racial hierarchy in this country and to use it to bring together these diverse groups of people in order to fight for our rights as a political group.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think of that as being a social and cultural, I'm sorry, a social and political alliance, right? And it makes me think about the category women of color, right? Which originates very specifically in the late 1970s at a women's rights conference in which Black women and Asian American women, African American women and Asian American women came together and said, we have a separate kind of list of grievances and demands for our rights, because it's, what we need is different from what middle-class white women need and are considering. And so women of color originated very specifically, not as a identity label, not as a demographic label, but as a marker of political solidarity.
Thank you. Actually, that kind of leads to another question that we have. I feel that many individuals or communities aren't aware of the close connection and allyship between Asian, Blacks, and Latinx community had during the civil rights movement. How do we promote and educate the public about these past relationships? And what ways can we reignite this allyship?
Yeah, I know Theresa a lot to say. I'll just say one thing. I think really is essential for us to think about ethnic studies and the history of racialized minorities and other oppressed groups in the United States as a whole, to better understand how what are often presented and thought of as individual fights are actually collaborative solidarity struggles, right? So when it comes to labor rights, for example, Asian workers and Latinx workers in the United States and its territories have collaborated for more than 100 years, right, on labor rights. That history is not told because for a lot of different reasons, right? But we need to have that kind of history told.
And I'll add that it's more important than ever, today to try to strengthen that allyship, as you call it, because, there are always going to be efforts to pit different racialized groups against one another. And, in that kind of competition, nobody wins. I think our goal in trying to achieve any kind of equity is to break down the racial hierarchy that exists, right? And it's based on white supremacy, and there are lots of efforts, especially in contemporary politics right now, to deny that. But in fact, that's what has maintained the inequity for all of these groups. And so instead of, the groups that are oppressed and, on the bottom end of the hierarchy, fighting with each other, the only way that we can achieve equity is to fight alongside one another and build that solidarity and coalition.
Hi, I couldn't have my screen on, but I'm Sue and I'm part of the Northwestern team. I'll also be helping Ivy ask some questions. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more on how does learning history foster and promote positive relationships, relationship building amongst different racial groups, and how important history is in social justice.
Well, so, since I got my PhD in history and I think Ji-Yeon did as well, we're both, absolutely, in support of this idea that it's important to learn our history. So for Asian Americans, for example, there's been a tendency, for those who, haven't learned our history and, maybe because of more recent immigration and lack of opportunities in our K through 12 system and higher ed, there becomes more of a reliance on stereotypes and, impressions that are out there in mainstream culture and in our media. So that can promote a certain belief even from within our community about, who we are. But if we learn our history and we learn about, Asian Americans' inclusion in this system of racial hierarchy that has plagued this country since its beginning, we understand that, as I was saying before, we need to form alliances with other communities of color, other oppressed groups, in order to bring about more equity and equality and social justice. And for Asian Americans, if we don't know our history, we don't know that there have been efforts, from the beginning, when our communities immigrated to this country, that there were people who, have been on the forefront, who have been political actors, fighting against the inequality that they've experienced. But, if we didn't know that history, for example, we would more easily buy into these stereotypes that Asian Americans, are apolitical or don't like to rock the boat or, want to keep things as they are and that they're all doing well and don't suffer from racism. So, learning our history helps us argue against that and gives us more strength and inspiration to continue with these struggles.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think another point that I want to make is that history is really, really long, and it goes back to, in many ways, the moment that people from Asia and the Pacific Islands either stepped on US soil, US territory, or were incorporated into US territory, right? So for example, I'm thinking about, Asian contract workers on Hawaii's sugar plantations and how they allied with each other and they struck for labor rights. Or for Chinese and Japanese migrants on the West Coast who filed literally thousands and thousands of lawsuits to claim, and Korean immigrants as well, migrants as well, to claim the right to citizenship, the right to exercise that citizenship, the right to economic equality, the right to housing, the right to education, the right to use that education in occupations, right? So the right to employment, and this comes from the 1800s all the way through to now, and for education as well. Like, we're very familiar with the right to bilingual education in the United States. It was a family of Chinese immigrants who sued for that right, and it was their case that established that right. So these kinds of things, to understand that history and to understand, how the Asian and Pacific Islander fight for their rights, establish rights for everybody.
Right, and I also think about the cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court, during Japanese internment, right? Fighting for civil rights and civil liberties. Those were really important cases where, folks like Fred Korematsu took his case all the way to the Supreme Court and even until the end of his life, really fought for civil liberties that, didn't necessarily just have to do with Japanese Americans and their incarceration during World War II, but he fought for the civil liberties of other groups as well.
Exactly. Yes.
That's amazing. Thank you for your responses. I also want to highlight how Illinois is the first state to require Asian American history education in K through 12, which is so exciting. I wish I had that in my curriculum. But I just wanted to ask, what kind of outcome do you expect to have on the new generation, as well as just speaking a little bit more about the curriculum and like what it includes?
So that was an effort to, use the power that we had in the legislature after electing a number of members to the General Assembly. So, the year that the TEACH Act passed, and the TEACH Act stands for Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History. So, that passed, during the pandemic when we were experiencing, an increase in anti-Asian hate. And we felt that there were enough of us in the General Assembly to push forward this approach to address that in the long term by educating Illinois students in the K through 12 level. So, part of it came out of, political, efforts to increase our representation, in a lawmaking body that, represents people all across the state. So that, we had enough of a critical mass to push something like this and to enact something in statute, using public policy to bring about change. And, the effort continues. So, in the budget that we're considering for a vote this week, we've asked for an extra $2 million to help with the implementation for this. So the initial bill made this requirement that in Illinois public schools, a unit of Asian American history would be taught, and the State Board of Education was required to lay out some general guidelines. But initially, we weren't able to include any funding for implementation. And so a lot of affiliated groups, foundations, nonprofits, advocacy groups came together and put together some professional development opportunities for teachers. So currently teachers can sign up for these professional development courses, or workshops. Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago has a section on their website that includes, the various subject matters, within the curriculum that they'd like to include. But, once we pass the budget this year and it includes additional funds for implementation, we'll be able to have even more opportunities to, get that professional development out there so that school districts and teachers can more easily be in compliance.
Yeah, I'd also like to say that despite all the difficulties in implementing a law like this and getting the resources, not just economic resources, but also personnel, people, teacher resources to implement this, it's quite remarkable that Illinois was able to pass this law. I'm thinking about, I was just in New York last month, or a few weeks ago, and in New York State, they've been trying to pass a law like this to teach African American history in the public schools for the past 20 years and have not been successful. Right? There's a new push there for a law similar to the Teach Act in Illinois. And it wasn't successful during the last legislative season in New York State Assembly. And it doesn't look like it's going to be successful anytime soon. So, Illinois is really in many ways at the forefront of the country in passing a law like this. And so I think it's really important that Illinois also, be successful in implementing this. It's going to take a lot of different pieces have to come together. Yeah, but
California wasn't able to pass an ethnic studies requirement either. I think that was an effort from a few years ago that came up short. But I will tell you that in Illinois, the only reason that this was possible, had a lot to do with the increase in representation in the General Assembly. So like I said, there were 5 of us, and from when I first got elected and began my term in 2017, I began kind of educating my colleagues about the specific needs and experiences of the Asian American community. And I was the only one for 2 years. And then I was joined by a couple more colleagues. And then by the time we passed the Teach Act, we had 5. Now we have 9. But, this is an example of how representation matters, and that, we can get positive results from, having a group of us working together and with our colleagues. And I will say that the alliances that we built and the solidarity that we built with our Latinx caucus and Black caucus colleagues was really key to our ability to pass this, because if we had been operating in a competitive manner, during those 5 years, and just arguing for whatever I could get for myself or the Asian American community, without regard for understanding the needs and how I can help with my other colleagues of color, then they wouldn't have felt comfortable in supporting what I needed, right? So there were a number of years where I would educate them about the Asian American community, but also vote on bills, that had to do with racial equity, criminal justice reform, immigration, those kinds of bills. They knew that I was an ally to them. And so when the pandemic happened and there were examples of, rising anti-Asian hate, we brought that to the attention of our colleagues as well. We stood up on the House floor, when the Atlanta spa shootings took place, and, just explained that, look, Asian Americans are, going through this right now, and we need a remedy and we need your help. And so, by the time the bill came around, we were able to show the need, and then also the allyship and coalition building that had taken place in the preceding 5 years, so that we had their support, and we were able to pass this, in our legislature.
Yeah, it really shows the importance of progressive solidarity in our, government leadership. One of the things I would like to see the Teach Act develop into actually is something that I feel is really, really important, which is teaching everybody's history in a way that demonstrates how everybody's history is intertwined. And so therefore our individual fortunes, whether as individual people or as individual communities, are 100% intertwined and interdependent on each other, right? That understanding of the collectivity of our economic, racial, political, education, health, equity is really important, right? And when I talk about that kind of codependence and interdependence, I really include white Americans in there, right? Because part of the bedrock of racial inequality is economic inequality. And that economic inequality is across all racial groups, including white people. And, you know, it's going to require that every demographic, every group in the United States understands that their fortunes are intertwined with each other for us to, number one, kind of pull ourselves out of the current mesh that we're in as a country. And number two, you know, make sure that we're progressing, moving toward a future in which equity for everybody is plausible, achievable.
Thank you very much for that detailed explanation and answer to this question. I do have a follow-up question regarding the education curriculum. So whenever I bring up, you know, we are the first state at being able to do this Asian American teaching in K-12, a lot of people have concern about whether the PI part, Pacific Islander part, will be included. How can we ensure that we're not neglecting the even more marginalized group within AAPI?
I think you'll see that, well, you know, I would recommend going to the Asian Americans Advancing Justice website and, you know, looking through their links and resources. I'm, you know, pretty certain that, you know, the Pacific Islander, you know, experience is definitely included in that. But you know, this is going back to, you know, one of our answers earlier about, you know, the experience of racialization and how ideas about racial, you know, inferiority. I mean, I think that in the 19th century, you know, with the history of, you know, US imperialism, you know, that story about how Pacific Islanders, you know, were, you know, incorporated into these racial ideologies. I think that, you know, that's a really crucial underpinning of, you know, how we got to where we are today. So I think that that's, you know, certainly a part of the story that you know, has to be told, absolutely. But also, you know, the previous question about you know, how we need to talk about all of our histories together. I think it leads to answers that were, you know, on your list of questions about the model minority myth and, you know, why that's unproductive, right? Because that's based on sort of singling out Asian Americans as better than, you know, all other racialized groups, and, you know, trying to use that idea as a wedge to kind of break down these potential alliances. And so I think that that idea is extremely dangerous. And, you know, if you look at the work that you all do on health equity, right? I mean, and if you look at the demographics of my district, you know, it's very easy to see that these ideas about Asian Americans, you know, not having to deal with race or racism, and they achieve by working hard and are better educated and don't suffer the same, you know, level of racism. You could see absolutely that that's not true, because, you know, there's some of the, you know, largest gaps between rich and poor, you know, with our immigrant population, and, you know, also the largest racial inequity gaps in terms of access and healthcare disparities. And so, you know, it's just not productive to hold on to that idea, and it doesn't get our community anywhere, nor does it help us, you know, build alliances with other racialized groups in order to achieve racial equality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that going back to making sure that Pacific Islanders are part of the discussion and part of the education curriculum, when we do a history of the United States that fully takes into account US empire, then the history and the contemporary situation of Pacific Islanders has to be addressed, because the majority of Pacific Islanders come from either former or current US colonies, meaning Hawaii, Guam, and Samoa, right? And that experience of colonization and conquest also indicates that there is a overlap in material discrimination between Native American indigenous peoples and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, right? That history of conquest, of US imperial expansion, is a really big part of why Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders exist here in this country in the first place, right? And then thinking about the importance of solidarity, right? And if we don't understand the kind of history that we all share, we're not going to really recognize our common ground in terms of where are the ways that we, where are the ways that we are similarly affected by various forms of discrimination in the United States. Right? And I'm thinking too about how we often overlook the importance of economic discrimination, material discrimination when it comes to Asian Americans. And I'm so thankful that Dr. Ma pointed that out. But when we think about that, it also then, I think, makes sense why there needs to be cross-racial solidarity, right? Not only among people of color, but with also white people, white Americans as well. Because, this is a long-standing historical discussion, right? Like, why is there no sense of class in the United States, right? Why hasn't class solidarity come to fruition in the United States? There are lots and lots of different reasons, but one significant reason is the use of race to divide and conquer. And that divide and conquer is not only among different people of color, but also between people of color and working class and impoverished white Americans as well, right? When racism, particularly some of the more virulent forms of white Christian nationalism, tell white Americans, well, just because you're white, you're better than everybody else, it can be a kind of salve, right, that allows people to not see the commonalities with your similarly impoverished Black, Brown, Asian, and Native brothers and sisters, right? And that is the kind of thing that can really encourage the growth of hate rather than the growth of solidarity.
Thank you. We're going to switch over for a little bit, as Theresa earlier mentioned, that there are more and more Asian American in positions of policymaking now. Do you see more equitable changes coming, and what do you predict will happen soon?
Well, I hope to see a snowball effect, and just our communities moving in a direction where this increased representation yields results and accelerates, more representation, more equity, because what I'm seeing, especially with my new colleagues in the General Assembly, right? We have 9 Asian Americans serving in the General Assembly now, and so in the House, there are 8 of us, and we are able to bring the voices of our constituents, into these rooms where decisions are being made about resources and how they're distributed, and policy changes, that affect people's lives. And so, I have colleagues that are representing, concentrations of Asian Americans in different parts of the state, like, Uptown and Argyle Street, Devon Avenue, Naperville, and, just bringing the voices and the experiences of their communities to the table, so that things are happening, in policy making and in the distribution of resources that's different from the way it was before, where we had no representation. So, for example, in the realm of healthcare equity, for example, that's been an important issue for me for, as long as I've been in the General Assembly. And, a really big, important part of healthcare access is language access. And so, I've been pushing for better language access in government services for the last 7 years that I've been in the General Assembly. And so, as we continue our work and are successful in these areas, we can move towards greater equity. I'm also working on removing barriers to licensure for internationally trained healthcare professionals. This is a way that we can address the healthcare provider shortage, but also, encourage more people who have bilingual ability and language competency to be able to rejoin the healthcare workforce, where they, may have had experience and training and licensure, in their home countries, but, found it difficult to regain that here in Illinois. And so, I think that working on those kinds of problems will help us achieve better equity in the healthcare realm. And my colleagues have other areas of interest and specialization that they're working on that many times comes from their own experience, right? Either as refugees or, folks who have specific experiences, as Asian Americans.
Thank you. You already kind of answered some of our other questions that we wanted to ask you. And then actually we see there are a lot of Q&A questions. So I think we will jump right into that instead. And I'll let Tracy go ahead with some of that Q&A question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ma, and thank you, Dr. Yu, for sharing. We definitely have learned a lot. But some folks who attended this panel discussion, they also have some other questions that they put together in the Q&A section. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. They wanted to know, like, how, from your perspective, how do you incentivize awareness without promoting stereotypes? What do you think active allyship looks like in terms of workplace?
Also, let me try to address that question in terms of active allyship. I think I like to think of it really more as active solidarity, right? To me, that word ally implies that it's not your cause, but you're supporting somebody else's cause. Whereas I think when it comes to the kinds of social and political and economic inequities that we're talking about, it's common ground. These are common struggles. And so for me, that really means solidarity, which is recognizing that my struggles have a similarity to your struggles, and that if we work together, then together we can address those issues and gain some measure of justice and rights for both of ourselves, for both of our communities, right? So active allyship, solidarity to me means that we're not working on things as this is your issue and I'll help you with it, and this is my issue and you help me with it, but rather recognizing that these are our issues and we collaborate together on them.
And let me add to that too with a very relevant current example. So, several weeks ago, I was at an event and a member of the Chinese immigrant community who was sitting next to me at this dinner said to me, what are we going to do about all these migrants coming to Chicago? We don't have the resources to help them all. We shouldn't be allowing them to come in. And I said to them, well, they're human beings. And, when my grandfather came to the United States in 1924, he was not authorized to be here. He was not welcome to be here, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? My grandfather was a paper son and, basically had to live for 40 years in this country, in the shadows, feeling and being treated as if he wasn't wanted. And so, if we had had any political power or representation, back then, which we didn't, I think that things would be different. And so, the way that, my decisions are made in the treatment of people who are coming to Chicago, who need resources, who are new to this country, is that, I will do everything in my power to make sure that they're treated as I would have wanted my grandfather to have been treated, back in the early 20th century. And that, our communities wouldn't be here today if it were not for those people who made those sacrifices and came to this country and did what they could to survive, regardless of whether they were welcome. So this is an example of how a lot of times we assume that, okay, well, these migrants are from Latin America and we're Asian, and so that doesn't have to do with us. But in fact, it does have to do with us. And the sooner we help people get on their feet, and established, the sooner that they will become taxpayers and that they will contribute to our society, because, that's what they want to do. But, if we withhold resources, actually, we make things worse for all of us, right? If somebody doesn't have health care and they end up going to the emergency room, it costs more. And, there's no choice but to pay it, right? But if we plan and work together and coordinate and figure out how to redistribute resources in the right way, then, we can help people become established and become contributing members of our society faster and help everybody.
Yeah, now that's really important. Right now, globally, the refuge situation and the migration situation has really reached, sort of unprecedented heights historically. And if you think about, well, what happens if we allow migrants and refugees into our country, right? Isn't that a burden? Sure, it's a burden in the short term, right? But it's something that could happen to any of our communities, right? The global political situation, regional political situations are so volatile. That's why we have so many refugees and migrants worldwide, right? It could happen to any of us, any community, from Europe, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, anywhere, right? But long term, right, short term, bringing them in and allowing them in might be a problem in terms of quote unquote resources. But the United States remains a very wealthy nation, right? And long term, what happens is that migrants and refugees, they build families, they gain education and they work skills, and they become really important and very productive members of society, right? And demographically, that means we all benefit, right? We're going to need healthcare workers, all kinds of workers, teachers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, construction workers, all kinds of workers for this country to keep on going, right? Who's going to do all that work, right? Born and raised in the United States, Americans are actually not reproducing at very good rates, right? And so if you take away immigration from the US population, we have a severe labor shortage. Schools would have to close down. Hospitals would have to close down, right? Middle-class white Americans would not be getting the services and the health care that they're accustomed to because the labor would not be there to support it. So immigration, including refugee and migrant immigration, benefits everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, I do agree that for short term it might not be like a burden, but in the long term, if we can help them get temporary housing, maybe to get them like even a temporary cash job, they could still make a living. In the shelter, people like not only stay there for watching TV, they also would go out to the neighborhood during the day to look for jobs, which is really inspiring. And then this is why our family have moved to the United States, because this is a land of opportunities. We also came here for a better quality of living. So yeah, definitely agree on that. And then there's there are too many questions in the Q&A chat box, and then we couldn't ask all of them today. But there's a question on education that I really wanted to ask Dr. Ma, because you have discussed about the Teach Ed and that the state does not provide any funding for implementation, originally. So do you see a role for like a university like Northwestern, that what we can do to help build curriculum or resources to support a Teach Ed or teaching Asian American history on the K-12 level? If you know of anywhere that work is being done, could you share?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, Asian Americans Advancing Justice and some other advocacy organizations are coordinating with, and they've gotten funding from some foundations and have been working with higher ed programs in teaching, education higher ed programs to offer more of those classes. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to I guess contribute to those workshops to make them more available. I would reach out to AAAJ and see where the needs are, because they're coordinating those efforts. Once we are able to get the additional 2 million in the budget, we can use that through the ISB network and make sure that those opportunities are more widely available in all the school districts around the state. So it'll be, I guess, a parallel effort, but I think for now what what's already established is being coordinated by Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and you can definitely connect with them to see how you can help.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're going to see in coming years as the TEACH Act is implemented is that education schools and teacher accreditation programs throughout the state are going to be more interested in sending their students to Asian American Studies and Asian American History courses, right? And so that also means that higher education institutions throughout the state need to be prepared to be able to offer those kinds of courses. And currently, I think really there are only 3 in Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, University of Illinois Chicago, and Northwestern that are prepared to offer those kinds of classes.
Thank you so much. I believe we still have time for one more question. So this question is from Aida. What percentage of the AAPI community are immigrants or if they are undocumented? Because Medicaid program in our state, Illinois, can now cover migrants from the age of 42 or above. And Medicaid is now considering to also include in the Medicaid benefits, like social determinants of health, for example, like health, food, housing, transportation. And the current Illinois legislature is asking for comments to these clause.
Right, those are decisions that are being made this week, in fact, as we get ready to vote on a budget. So, we're going back to Springfield on Wednesday, and the hope is that we'll have a budget and we'll have been able to vote on it before Friday. And one of the big questions is, whether we are able to maintain the Medicaid services for undocumented adults age 42 and above. Our state was the first state to offer healthcare for undocumented seniors. We started with 65 and above, and then moved to 52 to 64, and then added 42 to 52. And so, I will tell you that the big debate right now is, how much does that cost and whether that's sustainable in the budget. And, I've had Zoom meetings from 8:30 this morning until after 10, precisely on that topic. And it does affect a good proportion of Asian immigrants. I don't know what the proportion is exactly off the top of my head, but there are quite a few undocumented Asian Americans, and they're largely invisible, right? I think most people don't think of the undocumented population as including Asian Americans, but in fact, it does. And so for our caucus, it's been important to be supportive of these efforts to expand healthcare, because, healthcare access is, I think maybe one of the top priorities, that and education. Those are really key priorities for our communities. And so, it's our obligation to make sure that the needs and desires of the community and their voices get heard when these decisions are being made. And so we're doing our best to ask the right questions, because we're, there's a little bit of disagreement between the governor's office and the legislature as to exactly how much these services will cost. So those are debates that are being hashed out as we speak. And we're going to be voting on that this week.
Yeah. Just very quickly, the rates or proportion of undocumented in Asian American communities varies by national origin. So I know that there are high rates in both the Filipino and Korean communities of undocumented people. So for example, Jose Antonio Vargas, the Washington Post reporter who came out as undocumented, he's Filipino. And in the Chicago area, you know, I know that for Filipino and Korean American community organizations working on immigration issues, the undocumented issue is key because so many people in those two communities are undocumented and therefore don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to good access to education.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for joining us today. And thank you for everyone else to join us. I apologize that we didn't have enough time to go through all the Q&A questions, but I really appreciate everyone. And just a reminder to register for our June themed events on June 15th, and also check out One Book events for throughout the year. Thank you, everyone. You have a great day.